Hello, friends. Welcome back to the School of Self-Worth. I'm your host, Nicole Song. Today, I have such a special treat for you. I got to sit down with Lori Matsukawa, who is a journalist in Seattle and a long time just icon for journalism in the Seattle area. She was an anchor for many, many years at KING-5 here. And then she also was a co-founder of the Asian American Journalists Association for Seattle. She is a woman who has done so much in her career, and I really truly consider her to be someone who laid the foundation for women like me to come after her. Like, I truly feel that so much for Lori, and she has been so supportive of me in many different ways. She helped launch my last book, 24 Ways to Move More. She is someone I have looked up to and admired truly for such a long time. And today's conversation is so expansive. We get into all the different details of her life, her challenges being the only Asian American woman in many of the newsrooms that she was in, interesting and fascinating experiences that she had as she grew, as audiences grew with her. So I just cannot wait to share this with all of you. And if you are an ambitious Asian American woman who wants to manifest a promotion in 60 days or less, DM me, manifest on Instagram at Nicole Song. I have something for you. All right, friends, let's dive into this really incredible conversation. I am so excited today because we have Lori Matsukawa on. Lori, welcome to the School of Self-Worth.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks for having me.
Well, Lori and I go way back, and I just was so excited to get to ask her questions because Lori and I know each other from the Asian American Journalists Association in Seattle. That's where we first met. And I remember when I first met, everyone would be like, "Oh, Lori is coming." And I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, Lori
Yeah.
is coming to our events," because Lori has been an anchor or was an anchor on King TV here in Seattle for decades and was just a really, for me, I always think about like my life and my ability to do the things I do in the world are because of trailblazers like you. And so it was so fun for me to think about like, let's have Lori on to talk about your journey and also to talk about where you are these days because she's retired from journalism. And then I had so many questions for her. But previously, Lori's also been an amazing support of mine. When I launched my book, 24 Ways to Move More, she interviewed me for one of my events. And I've just always felt, Lori, like you have just such a generosity of spirit in the way you support other women, in particular Asian American women. And so, first, I just want to honor and acknowledge you for that. So, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. That's very generous of you. I've always thought that it was part of my purpose in life, if you will, to support women, first of all, and women of color specifically, because particularly in broadcast, television broadcast news, there were very few of us. I started in 1978, which back then there weren't that many of us, frankly. And it's been kind of a goal of mine to encourage people of color, particularly women of color, to consider journalism, for one, and then to pursue it in college, and then to advance themselves, to work in a bigger market, work for a larger paper, have their own podcast, which is very exciting. And as the technology has changed and as we've matured as a society, I've been so excited to see it actually happen. Something we started 40 years ago, the Asian American Journalists Association that you mentioned. It's now bringing forth fruit so abundantly. It's kind of mind blowing when you think about it. And it leads to some pretty funny and awkward moments because you get to be called a pioneer, and when you think of a pioneer, you think of these craggy face, like white haired old ladies. But in a way, we are pioneers. And, you're kind of a pioneer too, Nicole, because of podcasts, the new technology, it kind of brings you into something new that you're inspiring younger people to pursue. So that's great. That's really great.
Beautifully said, Lori. And the thing that I'm excited about is to really ask you about your history because I've never really been able to, and particularly not in an environment like this, to find out more because I have always wondered, like, I know my experience, for those of you who don't know, like, I was in journalism, like early 2000s to like 2012 or so. And so I know the time, what it was like at that time. And by that time, there were a lot of organizations. AAJ was a huge support for me. It's how I found jobs. It's how I felt connected and had community when I was a journalist. But I am really curious, by the time I was there was so much more effort towards it. Diversity mattered within newsrooms and representing the communities. But I can only imagine in the 1970s, like this had nothing to do with it at all. And so I would love to hear your journey, because we do, like a pre-interview, and Lori was Miss Teen America in 1974. And I was like, I did not know these things about her. So I would love if you would share with us a bit of your journey, because as you know, like this podcast is School of Self-Worth, and I can only imagine what it must have taken within yourself to be able to say yes and to put yourself forward into the jobs that you ultimately had, right? Being the voice every evening on the news takes something. So I would love it if you would take us through your journey a bit from the beginning.
Well, originally I was born and raised in Hawaii, and I originally thought I would be a piano teacher when I grew up because I adored my piano teacher. So when I was a junior in high school, I began looking around for scholarship money, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, I heard about this contest. It's called Miss Teenage America. The winner gets $10,000 in scholarship." And I thought, "Wow, that is spectacular." And he said, "And the best part is you don't have a bathing suit competition, so you might have a chance." I Thank you, I think. So
Right.
I just kind of not, had no idea what I was getting into, but I applied and I won the Miss Teenage Honolulu contest because it required a current events test, it required a talent, and it required an interview with the panel of judges. So I thought it went pretty well. And so I became Miss Teenage Honolulu, represented the city of Honolulu in the national contest, Miss Teenage America, which was broadcast on CBS television out of Fort Worth, Texas. And it was terrific because we got to meet our MC, who was an actor named Ken Berry. You don't know this because you're too young, but Ken Berry was a television actor, and he was in a TV show called F Troop. And he was so talented. He's not only an actor, but he could sing, he could tap dance. I mean, and he was a wonderful MC and host. And so we got to do our pageant thing. All 44, I guess there were 44 of us gals on the stage representing different cities throughout the country. And I won the Miss Stage America pageant. I had no clue what I was doing, but I won this pageant. And for the next year, my senior year in high school, my job was to half the time finish high school and then half of the month travel as Miss Teenage America. And that required um, our sponsor was the Dr. Pepper Company, so we rode the Dr. Pepper float at big parades, the Orange Bowl, the Indianapolis 500, the Kentucky Derby.
Wow.
We went to
Yeah.
big cities. We went to New York and Miami, but we also went to small towns because Dr. Pepper had bottlers in small towns too. So Tullahoma, Tennessee, and Bald Knob, Arkansas, and it was just a wonderful year. But here's the deal about journalism: every time I went to a different town, I was interviewed by journalists, television, radio, and print. And I began to think, wow, these people have a great job because they get paid to talk to people. That was my very simple observation. And so by the time I got to Stanford University, I said, okay, I'm not going to be a piano teacher. I think I want to be a journalist. And I started studying journalism in college.
That's an amazing story. I love that because I actually always used to think that was one of the best things about journalism, is that you are paid to basically ask people a ton of questions about
Right.
themselves, and
Right,
then
you
you get to
talk to
learn.
people and you go to really cool places. I said, oh, I can go to the Kentucky Derby and talk to people. That's really cool. That kind of
Yeah,
thing.
that's incredible. So then did you focus that on that in college and then pretty much choose that as your
Yes,
career
I
from that
majored
point forward?
in communication and American studies also because I figured journalists have to know what they're reporting about. So American studies at Stanford was terrific because we studied American literature, American history, and American political science. So it's a terrific journalism kind of a package for for me anyway. And I worked at the Stanford Daily newspaper as a reporter and editor because they didn't have a broadcast program. They only had a print
Mm.
program. And then in the summers, I applied and got internships at the paper, the Honolulu Advertiser, back home in Hawaii. So I was really gearing up for a career in print journalism. And so my senior year in college, I I was ready to apply. And it was my print managing editor who said, in Hawaii, who said, "Have you ever thought of television journalism? They're hiring women these days." That's what it was like back then in the late
Wow.
70s, right? They're hiring women these days. You think you ought to apply, maybe? I said, "Oh, I never thought of that." Okay. So I got an internship at KPIX in San Francisco and sent out, resumes and photographs of myself to 100 different news outlets, both television and print. Out of the 100 letters I sent, I got 2 back that were positive. One was for the LA Times, and one was for a tiny TV station in Redding, California. So here I was in the Greyhound station in Redding going, LA Times, Redding, LA Times, Redding. And finally I just said, what the heck? I'm going to go with the television job because I figured you had to be young to do that. You had to carry your own gear. You had to drive your own car. And then I figured when I was wrinkled and toothless, then I would switch to print reporting because nobody would know what I looked like. That was
That's
my big
amazing.
plan. That was my big plan. Okay, young person TV, wrinkled toothless person print. Got it. And
That's an amazing story. It's so funny the decisions you make when you're like 22 years old or the way you think about life choices, right?
and so and then I was in, the television industry for like basically 40 years. And I thought, well, I guess the wrinkled and toothless part never came enough. And as it turns out, print journalists also became video journalists too, right?
They did.
They
Yeah.
had to be camera
Ultimately, they did.
they had to be
Hmm.
camera ready themselves. So the wrinkled and toothless
Yeah.
thing never panned out.
Well, I love how you thought about it. I'll be wrinkled and toothless someday,
And they'll never
which
know. And they'll
they'll
never
never
know.
know. Well, I'm curious then, could you share with us, like, we're still in the late 70s at this point, right? Like, what was it like, especially, well, being a woman and then being a woman of color in a newsroom? Because I'm imagining Redding, California was not that diverse.
It was not. Um, and I think I was the first person of color that they hired in their history of television news. And by the time I got to Portland, Oregon, my second market, it was a little bit more diverse. There were other journalists of color, but again, not too many. And I encountered a great deal of racism for a town like Portland, which you think on the West Coast would be a little more, cosmopolitan, accepting. But on December 7th in Portland, Oregon, I got a very racist phone call in the newsroom. And I was so stunned because I had never heard such anger and racist comments. If I had a gun, I would go out on the streets of Portland and I would shoot you Japs, that kind of thing. And
Wow.
I was so stunned, I didn't know what to say. And finally, there was an African American coworker next to me, and she just said, "Hang up!" And you could see her off, off to the side saying, "Hang up!" And I just hung up. It was just kind of it was frightening, but it was my first real exposure to that kind of overt racism, and it kind of woke me up to the reality that was what was on the continental U.S. Right?
Right. Well, especially you growing up in Hawaii, which is a
Mm-hmm.
much more diverse place, and then moving, to the West
Right.
Coast
Right.
and then going through those experiences. What do you think helped you during those times to figure out like how to be yourself and how to stay in your job, frankly, when you're getting threats like that?
Well, of course, my colleagues were very sympathetic and very supportive, and my news directors too. They
Mm.
they were hiring me knowing full well what I looked like, what I sounded like, where I was from, but they were willing to take a chance on a relatively new kid in the industry. And so by the time I was hired in Seattle, my third, fourth year out of college, I I was very grateful to get here because, again, it was a large city, it was West Coast, it was cosmopolitan, and there were people of color already on the air. Um, there was Hattie Kaufman, she was on the air. James Hattori was at King. And there were people who were already there blazing the trail. Barbara Tanabe had just left. Wendy Takuda was on the air. So I felt that there were, you know, people opening the door already here in Seattle. But there was no concerted group kind of lobbying for journalists of color. And that's why three of us started the AAJA, Asian American Journalists Association chapter in Seattle. You know, it was in 1986, 85 or 86. And the three of us, Ron Chu at the International Examiner, Frank Abe at Cairo Radio, and myself were the first co-presidents of the chapter.
That's amazing. Well, do you feel like back then, when you think on it, sometimes we don't see, right? When I think of this as an Asian woman, like I just don't even think about it, right? You don't think about it. You're walking down the street, you're just like living your life, and then someone else brings up your race to you. Like that's a very common experience. And if you felt that way, and I used to feel that way in work too, like I would just be like, well, I'm just being me, and I'm like a smart, capable human with lots of ideas and things to offer. And then it's other people who would have different views of what was going on. And what do you feel like your experience was when this is happening, when people would bring stuff up? Because I'm sure that first experience, which sounded terrible, wasn't the only time you had experiences like that through your journalism career. I mean, you became the main anchor on King, like you were on TV every single day. And even if that had become normal because you were the one, that didn't mean necessarily that people were probably always that accepting of it. So I'm curious, like what your experiences were like with that.
It wasn't normally in my face as much as that experience in Portland was. But I remember there was this group called the Aryan Nations. They were this very white supremacist group in Idaho, and they were kicking up a ruckus. And so I really wanted to cover this story. Don't ask me why. But I thought it was a really outrageous group, and I thought I should cover this story. Wisely, my news director said, Lori, I just don't think you're the one that should cover this story. And thank goodness that he said that, because, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I probably would not have been the most effective journalist to cover that story. But one thing that happened was I was sent to cover the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I did it not only for King, but for the NBC network affiliates as an affiliate, kind of reporter. And if they wanted a live shot from Pearl Harbor, I would provide these affiliates a live shot. And apparently, unbeknownst to me, I'm just doing my thing in Honolulu. Uh, there were so many viewers who called the station at King and said, were yelling and screaming about my grandfather was killed in the bombing on Pearl Harbor, and why is that, again, Jap reporter reporting about it from Honolulu? Why is she doing it? I'm never going to watch King again. Just so many terrible calls, to the point where even the news director himself was on the desk answering phones. And from what I understand, he was actually yelling at some of these viewers who were calling in. And he says, we sent her because she's the most qualified. She is from Hawaii. She knows what she's talking about. She knows the history. She knows the geography. She, is the best qualified to cover this story for us. It has nothing to do with her being Japanese American, but people were very expressive, and I guess I was very grateful that he took the stand he did. He just he wouldn't stand for it. He just wouldn't stand for that kind of racism. So I had, mentors in that way who just said, no, we're moving forward, people, and kind of carried the market forward that way.
Yeah, well, that's so beautiful that you had people like that who were advocating for you. I mean, truly, because it makes such a difference to starting to get people to that next level. And then, with you, I guess my last question, because I want to talk about your book, because she also has a children's book, which is very much about knowing your story. For you, like, were there ever times where you're like, was this the right choice? Should I be that person? Or do you feel like, oh, wow, like, or did you ever feel like you were the one making the difference simply by being on air night after night?
I think being there was probably the most important thing I could think of. It's kind of cliche now, but really at the time I felt it was important, one, to, be the co-founder of the Asian American Journalists Association and open the eyes of news directors and editors in the Seattle area to the fact that we existed. So that became like a little side gig of mine when I was, working as an anchor person, promoting the Asian American Journalists Association, raising money for scholarships, because I would talk to editors and say, you really should hire more Asian American journalists. And they would say, well, we would, but where are they? We don't find them. We can't find. And I'd say, well, we'll just have to get them to you. And so that's when I knew we had to start that pipeline, right? You get the
Mm.
young people interested in journalism first, because Asian American kids, frankly, were not encouraged by their parents at the time to become journalists. They wanted to be, they were encouraged to be doctors and lawyers, nurses, teachers, but nobody's parents said, hey, you should become a journalist. So we had to talk to young people and say, hey, consider journalism. Two, we had to send them to college, so we gave them scholarships. And three, once they got out of college, we had to find them jobs. And so that's where Asian American Journalists Association provided job fairs, where people and recruiters would come and hire these young journalists right out of college, sometimes right out of small market, place them, support them, promote them. And our goal was, oh, yeah, we want them to be in the chairman's office. We want them to be in the editor in chief's office. We want them to reach the highest goals in journalism. And so that was kind of like what we did for other journalists. We wanted to promote that. And I think we did a really good job, because look at you, Nicole. There are
I mean, I got my very first, like, my Seattle Times job came out from the New York AHA. I can't remember what year it was, where I
right.
met, the recruiter for the Seattle
That's
Times. And then
right.
that's how I got my internship with them. And yeah, that definitely started me down the pathway.
That's right. And we were able to teach, or I was anyway, I was able to teach young people to work together as a team, as a cohort, so that each group of young people that came to our convention, we taught them to stick together, take workshops together, go to the job fair together. Once they got their jobs, to stay in touch. When one is moving on up to the next job, they contact the people behind them and next to them and say, hey, I'm moving, apply for my job. So it
Mm.
becomes kind of like this ladder, a step ladder up and up for generations, we hope, of journalists. So,
Well, this leads me to another question, which I didn't expect to ask you today, but it's been coming up. And there's this one statistic I've seen, and this is not about journalism, this is general,
mhm,
that 55% of the workforce is women. And then of that, 35% is leadership. And then of that, it's only 3% are Asian American. And I'm curious because I feel like when I think about it, I don't know the stats for journalism, but I'm curious what you see in terms of barriers that still occur to this day for Asian Americans in terms of really stepping into leadership. Is there something that you see, or you feel like there's more work to be done to help and support that? Because again, I don't know if those numbers exactly correlate into journalism, but I imagine they're not totally far off.
I would think there needs to be a lot more visibility. We just have to place more Asian American women in positions of leadership. Like
Mm-hmm.
when people see it, they can be it, right? I know that's really cliche also, but it's really true. Which leads me to another story. When I was first appointed or told to be an 11 o'clock Monday through Friday night, 11 o'clock main anchor of a major newscast, it wasn't a very long period of time before I was rapidly replaced by a different news director. A new news director came to the station, replaced me with a white woman, and I was kind of put on the cable news. I was put on Kong, the 10 o'clock news on Kong, which was a brand new newscast, which had like a very teeny tiny audience. And I was told, you're going to build up this audience. And so I had a choice. I could stay at the station and work at Kong at a teeny tiny market and continue to be on TV, or I could march off in a huff with my feelings hurt and kind of try to prove a point. But I decided to stay, and because I felt at least I would have a platform to begin this being there. I would be visible still on this platform and continue my work of encouraging young people to become journalists. And in a few years, this white woman left the 11 o'clock position, and they said, well, Lori, can you take her place while we conduct a search for her replacement? I said, sure, I can take her place. So I took her place, and then I was there for the next 17 years. So it's right. It's one of those things where, I believe I was meant to stay and to be seen and to continue the work of encouraging young people to consider journalism as a field. I was there. I was going to stay there because it provided me a platform, and I feel like it was a good choice because it allowed me to continue the work of Asian American
Yeah.
journalists.
Yeah. Well, you bring up something that I talk a lot about on the podcast and with people around the emotional reactivity that can come up. Because sometimes it can feel like when you're being pushed aside or you feel like you're not getting what you deserve. And I think this happens to people in general, but particularly when you're like, is race involved? Like, is something else at play here? And then you have to be like, okay, can I put aside that part of me that's offended and upset? And then be like, what is the pathway that's the right pathway for me? Because ultimately you did that for 17 years and then you went on to anchor the evening news for all of your years after that. Is that right?
It was kind of the reverse. I was bumped out, and 2 years later I was to hold the spot until they found her replacement, and I basically became her replacement and I was there for the next 17 years.
Oh,
so
okay.
I became the 11 o'clock anchor with a little gap in between, right?
Okay, yes.
Like,
yes.
okay, I'm back, that kind of a thing.
Right.
And thank goodness I stayed. And another opportunity came at the end. Retirement was coming up, and King offered this sweet package for the veteran, journalists. So Gene Anderson took the package, Jeff Renner took the package, all of these, senior people took the package. But they said, okay, you and Dennis Bounds, only one of you can take the package. And I had seniority, and Dennis was like, Lori, are you going to take the package? And I said, Dennis, I am not. And he's looking at me like with saucer eyes. And I said, Dennis, I have this project I'm working on. It's on, Japanese American incarceration. I'm doing the definitive story for King TV. I can't leave right now. I'm busy. So you take the retirement package. So he goes, okay. So he takes the package. He leaves. I finished the incarceration series and packages, run a special. It wins an Emmy. It's my first Emmy ever in my career. And I'm thinking, okay, I was supposed to stay and do this, and not to win an Emmy, but to leave a significant story for King to refer to, for future journalists to look at, to learn this history. That's what it was for. So being there makes a difference. So for anyone who's shunted aside and you think it's because of my race and it's because of my gender, it's because of my, sexual orientation, whatever it is, you're right. Sometimes you have to kind of separate yourself from that emotion and say, really, what am I going to do about it? And sometimes in the case of women, Asian American women, it's you have to just continue to be there, so that people get used to the idea of women in leadership that look like you. Oh, she looks like, the leader I had. He looks like the leader I had. They're Asian American. So what? They look like the leaders that I had. You have to be that guy or that gal.
I mean, everything you're saying is so powerful because it's so true. Like being present, like part of it for me, like launching a podcast is like, well, making sure that Asian American women have podcasts. Like, how can you just be out there being someone who has a podcast to that degree and then being able to talk and have conversations with other powerful women so that people recognize that that voice exists versus being like, well, I don't know if I'm the one. I don't know if I should do it. Like it's so easy to kind of withdraw and say, I'm not the one who has to do that instead of just being like, nope. Here I am, because you had a job too that's so visible, and like that's a big part of it. Like you just being on air literally was a reminder night after night to see that position.
And it's sometimes it's a terrible burden too, because you feel like, I just want to go home and and you just can't quit until it's time to quit.
Well, I would imagine I have had other friends who are anchors, and you can walk down the street, like people are always like, I'm sure everyone's like, Lori Matsukawa, like they would see you.
Or in foreign countries. We were once in China, and we were in a random shopping mall, and not only did they say, hey, it's Lori Matsukawa, these people were from Canada. They weren't even from
Seattle.
So I'm like, oh wow, this is pretty weird, but
That's funny. Well, I'd love to switch our conversation to your book because she put Lori, congratulations first on Brave Mrs. Sato. It's amazing to be able to, I just know the effort it takes to go to the place of publishing a book. So congratulations on
Thank
your book.
you.
And I'd love to hear more about the story of it because I know it's very much about like owning your origin and what it is, and it's a children's book.
Hmm.
So could you tell us a little bit more about the book and like how this became? I mean, I actually don't know if it was a retirement project, but it's been something you've been working on, I know, since you did retire.
Right. I guess it first popped into my mind maybe a decade or so ago when my niece was doing a family history project, and I said, "Oh, who's it about?" "Oh, it's about," to her it would be her great grandma, my grandma. "It's about your grandma who was a picture bride." I said, "My grandmother was a picture bride?" And she says, "Yes." And I said, "And who said?" And she says, "Oh, grandma told me, my mom." My mom ended up telling my niece about her mom being a picture bride. Now, a picture bride, for those who aren't familiar, are these women who came from Japan to marry immigrant men in Hawaii plantations who who they didn't know. These are men
Mm.
who they met with pictures, photographs. They would exchange each other's photographs so that when the woman came off the boat, she would know who her husband was, and vice versa. He would know who his wife was. And there was absolutely, well, I would say there was very little that was romantic about it. It was basically a way to skirt immigration laws at the time. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but it was also a way for these immigrant men to actually start families because, it gets really terrible to think that you're just going to work on a sugarcane plantation the rest of your life without raising a family, getting married. So I find out my grandmother was a picture bride. Wow. So I start doing the research. I find a ship's manifest. Yes, she did indeed come to Hawaii in this date, 1914, at the age of 19. She was on this boat. And yes, I got her marriage certificate. She got married 2 days later to my grandfather. And I'm like, okay, so she was a picture bride. And so it inspired me to do more research. And I found out that this was thousands, thousands of women who immigrated from Japan. In going to Hawaii alone during this time period of 15 years, it was like 15,000 women from Japan came to Hawaii. And 11,000 women came from Japan to the West Coast US. That's 26,000 women from Japan who came to marry men they had never met. What a story, right? You're
Right.
a
Oh my
journalist, you
gosh.
go,
Yeah.
oh, wow, what a story. So I decided to write it as a picture book, as a children's story, because there are so many things about these women that inspired me. First of all, they were brave to come to a strange country where they don't speak the language to marry someone they never met. But two, they brought with them their culture and established it in Hawaii in a brand new place. And so, can I show you the cover here? Um,
Please. Yes. Show it to us.
so here's the cover. The illustrator is Tammy Yee. Tammy Yee lives in Hawaii, and she is just marvelous. This was her idea. She says, "Okay, here is your grandmother, the picture bride, coming from Japan." She draws it in sepia tones. You can see Mount Fuji in the background, and it's in
Oh,
sepia.
yeah.
And she's coming to her new life in Hawaii. So that's in color. And she's looking out and thinking, oh, that's where my new husband is. But she brings with her her Japanese culture, which is following her in the form of these cherry blossoms. They follow her from
Yeah.
Japan all the way back to Hawaii. And that's what these Japanese women did. These picture brides brought their Japanese culture. So the story is about a woman who shares Japanese culture through language, through food, through clothing like kimono, through flower arranging like ikebana, and with a young girl who begins to who learns the story from this woman who is her babysitter. And so this is a book that's basically based on my real life grandmother and my real life babysitter because I did these kinds of activities with my babysitter. So she's kind of a combined character that expresses what these picture brides meant to the people and the history of Hawaii.
That's incredible. I love that you were able to do that. Well, why did you want to do it as a children's book then?
Because I guess I was always told you write what you know, and so I felt like I couldn't tell really what picture brides really felt, because I wasn't a
Mm.
picture bride, but I was a child who experienced women who were picture brides, like my grandma. So I could write through the eyes of a child. And so this
Mm.
book focuses on a young girl growing up in Hawaii who's taken care of by this woman. And when the young child is challenged, she finds out, oh no, I'm not going to be able to come and see my babysitter every day because my parents are moving to a new town. She gets very sad and very scared, like, oh no, I don't think what if I can't make friends? Whoa, I'm so worried about moving to a new town. And this babysitter comforts her and says, I know how you feel. It was very tough for me to leave Japan and come here to Hawaii. I was a picture bride, and that's where the story of the picture bride comes forward. And the little girl learns about how brave this babysitter of hers is, just like any other young person would learn an amazing story from someone that they would never suspect of being so brave. And it's just a way of learning and appreciating someone that you thought you knew, but you really didn't until they shared
Mm.
their story. So,
Yeah, that's so incredible. Thank you for sharing that because I did not know about that history.
yeah.
And, you were really also saying that understanding your history and your story is so important. And what would you say about that? Like, why was it important for you to know that story? And what did it help you understand about yourself, like your lineage and who you are?
It really spoke to me in a couple ways. First of all, that I had this story in my family and I had to write it down, because if I didn't, my my son and my other relatives would not know this story. So I had to write it down for them. And then I thought, you know, everybody has a story like this. You, Nicole, you have a story like this. Everybody who reads it, you could have relatives from Sweden, you can have relatives from Cambodia or Ethiopia. Everyone has a story like this about someone who you would never imagine did something brave, made a choice, went this way instead of that way, and influenced your family forever. So once you get that nugget, you have to write it down and pass it on to the
Mm.
next generation. So that's what got me going. I said, I am so lucky I can pass this down. Everyone should pass it down too. That's my big story. So since retirement, okay, so this book came out last November, so it's been almost like a half year, 3/4 of a year now. And I've been going to libraries and schools and like service organizations like the Lions Clubs, encouraging people to donate these books to school libraries so that young people can read them and see themselves in it and write down their stories. That's what I end up
Mm.
telling all of them. Write it down so that you'll remember. It's really important.
What has it been like for you? Because as a journalist, you're trained very much to like be like the story is always outside of yourself. Like you're just sharing it. You're just the person who's conveying it, communicating it. But this is very personal. And so what has it been like for you to share something in the world that's very personal and very close to your heart? Like did it take something different within yourself to be able to say, okay, now I'm going to be promoting my book and like putting it out there into the world?
I don't think it's as personal as if it was a memoir, which I've actually written one, but it's not published yet.
Oh yeah.
Memoirs are a totally different thing. That is really
Yeah.
personal, and I'm kind of nervous about that. But this was not personal in the way a memoir would be personal. This is personal, but again, it's something that people can relate to. Everybody
Mhm.
has been very positive about it, and because they can see themselves in it, and because everyone was a child, everyone had a caregiver. It was maybe a relative, maybe not. Like in this case, it was not. It was my babysitter, but um, and they can relate to this idea of caregiving, culture sharing, learning, and learning to be brave. That's a really important thing. And where do you learn that? Who teaches that to you? So it's not anything that journalists should be afraid of, or I certainly didn't feel afraid of sharing this because, well, one thing, it is based on true facts. I did the research, so I didn't have any qualms about sharing it. To me, it's it's storytelling, and ultimately, as you know, journalism is storytelling.
Mhm.
So I feel real good about that.
Okay, amazing. Well, I love hearing that. Yeah, sometimes with the projects, even if it's not a personal story, it can feel like a personal effort to like put it out there.
Hmm.
But I love that I feel like your whole career, Lori, like you have just modeled it. And I feel like with such a clarity and a confidence that I think that for so many women, Asian women in particular, it can be hard to feel that confidence. It can be hard to embody that. And so I feel like it's important also to have such great examples of
Hmm.
it, like yourself.
Yep. And they again can find these examples all around them. They have
Mhm.
relatives, they have friends, they have mentors, they have peers. They are surrounded by people to be inspired with, but they should also look at themselves because they're pretty inspiring too. And maybe they've just never kind of thought about their own lives and thought, oh, I've done some cool things, right? It's okay. It's okay to think that.
Yeah, I love doing that. I love reflecting back for myself and with clients. We work on this a lot. Like, what are the big, bold, brave, scary things that you have done? Because it's not like you haven't, everyone has done them at some point. It's just a matter of whether you recognized it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then also remembered if you did it before, you can do it again. Because each time I think we take a leap, it's like with a memoir or the next thing, you're just sort of like, oh my gosh, that feels so intense.
Yeah.
But it's always possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. It,
Yeah.
it it does take a certain bravery, but then, you know, you always have to say, I don't know, maybe this is not what you say, but I always say, well, what's the worst that could happen? I always think, what's the worst thing that could happen? And if it just, you know, it it's worth it's so much of the time it's worth the risk. Your life is just so fleeting, and that's why I had to write the book because people had to know that they have stories to tell too. And I has
Mm.
to get out and I have to go to these schools. And my husband is always saying, you're so darn busy, why don't you just take it easy? I said, oh, I have to let people know. They've got to start collecting and telling their stories. There's no time to waste, so yeah.
Well, I don't think of it as like what's the worst that can happen, but I often think of it this way if like just one person is impacted, right? So it's sort of like similar
Mhm.
level, but for me, it's like with the podcast or if the book that I write, like if just one person's life is impacted deeply, then that is worth my energy and time, instead of
Okay.
trying to be like everybody,
Mhm.
because there's no way to know, right?
There's
There's
no
no way
way.
to know. And especially with, excuse me, especially with creative expression, I find for people, sometimes they can feel like, oh, like I want to impact so many people. And I'm like, well, creativity is for you. And then if there's one person who also gets it, then how cool is that?
That is very cool. And I'm glad you mentioned that because going to elementary schools to read this book has been so rewarding. I went to a rural school in, I guess it would be Kitsap County, and went to read to a largely Caucasian school, young kids, maybe kindergarten through third grade, and along with reading, I did a little flower arranging demonstration, an ikebana demonstration, because the character in this book does ikebana. And I had the school kids help me with it, I would say. Now, ikebana believes in very few stems in the arrangement. The fewer, the better. So I want you to tell me to stop, when to stop. And so I would put in 3 stems. I'd say, should I stop now? And they'd say, no. And then someone would say, yeah. So I'd say, okay, I'm going to put in another stem. And we'd go stem by stem. Should I stop now? No, yes. And then finally, I'd get up to like maybe 6 stems. I said, should I stop now? And then the kids would say, yes. And so I said, okay, we'll stop now and we'll look at the ikebana and we'll say, that looks really nice, don't you think? And they would say, yes. And as we were leaving the assembly, I could hear the students telling their teacher, oh, Miss Johnson, we have to have a unit on ikebana now. And
That's
not a single
awesome.
not a single one of those students was Japanese American or had probably heard the word ikebana before, but here they were. And I'm going, wow, books have that effect on kids.
That's awesome. I love that. And it's just simply like being yourself, going out there is what's changing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I mean, really just, I think, being a model, but also just showing the way, like how we can do things like that more and more all the time. Well, Lori, what a joy having you. I mean, I love this conversation because I just love getting to know you in this way, and it's so much fun. And I didn't prepare you for this, but we do also do rapid fire questions at the
Oh
end.
no.
So yes,
Well,
but
that's
you know, you're great on your feet. You've been bantering on television for years. You can do it. So they're really simple
okay.
too. They're just fun. So my first question for you then is, what is on your nightstand?
Uh, 3 books that I have started but not finished, and a fine layer of dust.
I'm the same way. I realized the other day I was in the middle of 5. I was like, Nicole, you got to pick one and just just finish it. Yeah. Okay, great. What's the last time you tried something new and what was it?
It was just this afternoon. I went to a uh, a sushi place that served sushi on a belt, on a little
The conveyor belt.
conveyor belt
Oh,
on
it's
one
your first time doing
side.
conveyor belt
Right,
sushi?
but this was super conveyor belt. It was conveyor belt sushi and rapid delivery like set.
Oh, yes.
So not only was there a sushi thing going around, there was if you ordered like a side of gyoza or something, whoosh, it would like zip out of the kitchen, and there was a robot serving beverages. So I don't know what to call that, but it was like a super.
Where was it?
It was right across from. It was right in Bellevue. It's called Kuda Kuda
Coulda.
Sushi.
I mean, when I was in Taiwan, we went to conveyor belt sushi and it was the same way. It's like there's 2 layers, right? There's like the main conveyor belt,
Yep,
and then above is like the fast one
fast
where if you
one.
order something on the side and then it just shoots it to your
Yeah, and
table.
then the rope. Did yours have the robot with the
I can't
beverages?
remember. I had many robot servers in Taiwan actually. There's like
And I'm
when
like,
you do hot pot, they have robot servers.
oh, it was great. It was so entertaining.
They're hilarious. And yeah, they kind of stop. They because they like if they hit you or they can sense it and then they like stop and wait
Yeah,
and
and
go.
they play this little
Yeah.
catchy like doo 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 doo, like here I
Yeah,
come with your
totally.
beverages. It's hilarious.
And he's well, that's so fun. I was
Okay.
like, because I was like, I always love conveyor belt sushi. So I was like, I want some, restaurant recommendations too.
Okay.
Uh, okay, amazing. And then let's see, what's the last thing you watched on television?
Last thing I watched on television. I guess I watched a news. Well, actually, that I actually sat down and watched was a Mariners game. I watched a
Oh,
Mariners game yesterday.
oh, that sounds nice.
Yeah,
Baseball on TV is very relaxing, I
I
find,
don't.
unless it was a close game.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, last one. What are your 3 favorite emojis that you like to use?
Oh, definitely smiley face. The smiley face. The laughing face emoji, and the shaka emoji because I'm from Hawaii.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, the shaka. Awesome. Well, Lori, such a joy to have you on. Is Brave Mrs. Sato available in like all the usual places for
Yep.
buying books?
Independent
Okay.
bookstores have them wherever you are, and of course, mail order too.
Yes, you can get them in other locations as well. So make sure you order Brave Mrs. Sato. And Lori, I am just so honored that you've been here, that you were willing to come on and share your story. And I just love hearing it from you. And it's such a joy to connect with you this way.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nicole. It's been great watching your career just shoot up to the moon. It's been wonderful. Love it.
Oh, thank you so much.